Hi everyone. We're moving into a section that's about what to do if your variable appears more than once in an equation. So I think you should see that, like the previous section, we'll start off with some linear equations that should feel familiar, and maybe even some of the other types will feel a little familiar, but I imagine you'll see things in here that you haven't had to do before. So we're going to adjust our strategy a little bit from the last section. In the last section, when the variable only showed up once, our job was just to get rid of everything that was attached to the variable. So we would look at order of operations and we would reverse that and apply inverse operations to get the variable by itself. That is still part of our strategy, but we have to do sometimes quite a bit of work to get to that point. So really, if you want to make it really broad, our goal is to get down to just one of our variable on one side of the equation and then reverse order of operations. The steps to get down to one variable can be fairly messy depending on how much mess is in your equation. So to give us a general strategy for when it shows up more than once, the first thing we're going to need to do is free our variable up from any mess that it might be trapped in. So if your variable is trapped in parentheses, generally you're going to distribute. That might be case by case. Maybe there's a power or something, but distribute is often a good way to deal with that. If your variable is stuck in a fraction, we're going to get rid of the fractions right off the bat by multiplying both sides by the LCD. And if your variable is trapped under a radical, we're going to try and isolate a radical and use the appropriate power to remove it. So if there's only one radical, that gets really obvious, the isolate. But if there's more than one, if there's a root x and a root x plus 1 both floating around, you just isolate either one of them and try and get rid of it. And then you might have to repeat the process to get rid of the other one, but that's still going to be your start. The appropriate power business is just if you're trying to get rid of a square root, you're going to use squares. So you're going to square both sides of your equation. If you're going to use a cube root, if you're going to get rid of a cube root, you're going to use a cube on both sides of the equation. So whichever power is going to be the inverse of your root. So we clean up any mess. Hopefully our variables are all free and floating around in fairly simple terms. And at that point, your goal is just going to be to move them all to one side and hopefully combine them all to the point where you just have one. In the next section, we'll talk about what happens when you can't do that combining, when no matter what you do, there's different powers of your variable, so they're not like terms. But for now, you should be running into things where you can combine. And then the last thing you're going to do is reverse back to that step we've been doing in the last section, reverse order of operations to get your variable by itself. So that's our strategy. If you're trying to write this all down, feel free to pause, but I'm going to move on to the next page and actually put this in action. So I'll start with some linear. Again, this might really be major review. If it hasn't been very long, it might be really easy review. Feel free to skip it if that's the case. You might want to peek really quick at what's going on with 2, 3, and 4 and see if you need a reminder. Otherwise, if you don't need linear, go ahead and move on and see what else is going on in this section. So for linear, looking at number 1, I don't see any mess. My variable, I do see it floating around on both sides, right? So really focus in on where your variable is. But it's not stuck in a fraction, it's not stuck under a root, it's not stuck in parentheses. Everything's just nice, neat terms. So really this is just a rearrange problem. So my first step is going to be to get all of my variables moved to one side of the equation and hopefully combined. And you can choose which side, that's entirely up to you. I'm going to go ahead and move the 3x over to the left. And the only reason I'm kind of liking the look of that is because then I get positive 5x instead of negative 5x. It's really not a big deal either way. Okay, so I moved my variables to one side. I was able to combine them. Now I get to go back to my reverse order of operations business. So x is being multiplied by 5, and then I'm subtracting 5. The first thing I need to do is get rid of the minus 5, so I will add 5 to both sides. And I get 5x equals 13. The last thing I need to do is divide both sides by 5. So I get x equals 13 over 5. And that's my answer. As always, good to practice checking. You don't have to do it for every single problem. You can check on answer keys. The computer will check for you. But practice that step so that you are ready to do it on an exam so you know if you messed up somewhere or not. Okay.